people, particularly in rural areas. Of course, also government expenditures are increasing, and we're starting to see these new areas that are exciting to people, like space tourism and all these types of things that are starting to come into the picture. You know, one of the other areas that we shouldn't forget, though, are these areas of spin-offs, and it's a real great honor to be with you because, you know, the ACT-6 satellite program is actually legendary at NASA. It was really the first NASA-ISRO collaboration, and you know, we hit it for 6 on the first time. Not only was it a successful mission, but it directly led to direct broadcasting systems from satellites, which had never been demonstrated before. So the spin-offs was in the hundreds of billions of dollars of value.
Absolutely, Alex. I think, you know, one forgets how early experiments and technological developments lead to long-term spin-offs in the economy. And today, DTH is so common. In 1975, when we first took these programs to villages, it was just amazing. It was something completely unknown there. But quick question on the economy and private sector participation, Alex. Do you see this as one area where, as in a few other areas, the big players, the very big players are going to be dominant? Are you just going to be, is the world going to be ruled by 3 or 4 big space companies, or do you see it much more widely spread?
So I think it depends on the sector. The history of space exploration in the US actually goes back, if you think about it, over 100 years on the private sector side. It was billionaires like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller who funded the first observatories. The first venture capital investment was in the 1940s. So the history of private sector involvement is really diverse. In satellite telecom, I think there's a chance for there to be kind of a few big players. At the same time, you know, some of the biggest new players have been these startups that become SPACs, and there is really a growth in that because of the low costs of satellites today. So I think there's really both going to be diversity, but also the high costs and barriers to entry do mean that there are some competitive advantages to first movers.
But also, as you said, Alex, and you know, I'm glad you touched on that because I know you've been one of the pioneers of small satellites called CubeSats and small sats. I think there's scope there for smaller companies. But let me just jump quickly in the interest of moving to a different topic and looking at our time constraints. Human spaceflight. You know, there's something that excites us tremendously. Everybody wants to be able to go out there and look down on the Earth and see what it looks like. But what is your outlook on human spaceflight? You know, for a while, the US took off on this, and man on the moon was the most exciting thing going by the end of the decade, which President Kennedy set as a target and did. Now there's a new and renewed interest with the Artemis program in particular. So where do you see this going, and what prospects do you see for human spaceflight?
Human spaceflight really is one of those great romantic human achievements, right? You know, there's always the question of why do we send humans, right? You know, robots can do these types of things. But the difference is that only humans can experience and only humans can tell stories. And the story of the Apollo program is kind of one of the most important of the 20th century. I think the Artemis program is going to be one of the most important stories of the 21st century, and I also think the Gaganyaan program is going to be one of the most important programs of the 21st century. The commitment by NASA, by JAXA, the European Space Agency, by the Canadian Space Agency, to return to the moon and to stay there for a long period of time, I believe is going to change the face of human spaceflight and actually potentially international relations, because by going to the moon and being committed to staying there long term, just like we've been living in low Earth orbit, we are going to now have to learn as fellow nations to operate hopefully and needfully peacefully on another world, which is something that we have never done, something we've never tried to do. But we have done it in low Earth orbit. The International Space Station is one of the great achievements, I would argue, of the latter part of the 20th century, and it came through Cold War competitors coming together in space in a way that they were not necessarily coming together in other areas. If you have anyone in your life who is under than 20 years of age, they have not lived a day without a human living off of this planet and living in space. And I'm incredibly excited for the future of the Indian spaceflight human spaceflight program, because there's only been 3 countries who have ever gone to space. Of course, US, Soviet Union, and China, and now there's going to be a 4th. And what happens as a result of that is not just technology and science, but it is new stories. And yesterday we heard from the co-founder of Netflix Personally, I cannot wait to see the science fiction RRR that results from the cultural impact of human spaceflight in this country. I am just so excited, and the world is really eager to welcome India into the human spaceflight community.
Absolutely. Till you make a traffic jam in space. We're very good at creating traffic jams. If there are 3 cars, we'll have a traffic jam. So prepare for that. But to the earlier question, which you yourself also mentioned, do you see this as being something genuinely useful in the long term and something which has spin-offs, or is it just a vanity project saying, we are first, we are second, we are third, we are fourth? But
I think one of the great values of these things is that they are literally moonshot programs. And when you set out a almost impossible task, you have to invent things and create things that you don't otherwise know you needed. And the best example of a spin-off is one that we don't talk about that much, which was that NASA did not invent the semiconductor. That was invented elsewhere. But for about 4 years, NASA and other space launch systems represented 75% of all demand for semiconductors in the world. What that meant was it scaled up the production of semiconductors to the point where then they could be used for other applications. It reduced their cost. And so by doing something so hard, like going to the moon and learning to live there, we're going to develop whole new types of technologies for life support systems, for artificial intelligence, for quantum communication potentially. So these are areas that by investing in these kind of dreams, these impossible challenges, and then realizing them, we create entire new fields of technology.
Quite right. I think the spin-offs from space have been phenomenal, and we can talk of that sometime. But I want to move to something else you mentioned, Alex. You talked of the International Space Station, and a tremendous example of how competing countries, rival countries, in some sense even enemy countries, come together and build something. What do you see as the future of international cooperation? There was a time when many of us, much of the world, hoped that space would be an area of deep international cooperation. We'll do it together. The UN treaties, which even treat the moon and other planets as, in some sense, belonging to all of mankind. So how do you see this playing out in a world of increasing rivalry? Are we going to see more cooperation? Are we going to see more getting together? Or do you see this as becoming increasingly complex? And are we going to weaponize space?
Yeah, it's a big question. My honest answer is it depends on us. It is going to be up to all of us, including the Indian space community, how this all plays out. The future has not been written, and it could go many ways. Space flight is inherently mixed with national security. There are deep implications of launch vehicle technology, of space flight. But I would also say that it has been through space that we have been able to create these peaceful relations. And I would argue that if we end up with conflict in space, we will have failed not just ourselves, but all of the rest of the future of humanity. And I think we have an opportunity for that not to be the case. As we return to the moon, we now have 23 countries who have signed a commitment through the Artemis Accords to uphold the UN treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, for only peaceful uses in space. We need more, and there needs to be continued discussion of that. Just in December, there was a resolution passed by the First Committee of the United Nations to ban tests of ASATs. The US has committed to banning ASAT tests, as have 8 other countries. So we have a long way to go, but I think it is really important that we don't forget the implications of our actions today on the future. And what we do now is going to impact the rest of humanity.
True. No, I'm glad to see optimism about the future in terms of space. And I think, yes, hopefully we'll have the wisdom to do that. You mentioned the International Space Station and habitations on the moon and so on. Jumping some years, maybe many years ahead, do you see prospects for manufacturing in space, either for economic reasons or for exporting or polluting carbonized industry out instead of our trying to move out, which is what many people suggest? We move our industries to the moon. All the pollution is done there, sadly for the moon, but great for us humans on Earth. Do you see any prospects of seriously doing that, or of using the resources of the moon or the asteroids or other planets 20, 30 years from now?
So I love this question because it's really a question about not just economics, but time. So in the fullness of time, we will have the potential to do all of these things. But if you think about where you're likely to move your manufacturing, your industry, we actually have a cost of per hour astronaut time on the International Space Station. In rupees, I did the calculations this morning, it is 1 crore per hour. So if you think about offshoring, usually you go to where labor is cheaper. It's not going to be cheaper. Now, I know this audience somewhat, and I know some of you out there are thinking, I can do it cheaper. And maybe you can, and I think we do need that type of innovation, but I think it's going to be many, many, many decades or centuries until we start moving our industry into space.
Okay, Alex, you mentioned time, and I see time's up. So I think this conversation, we could have gone on and on. Alex and I share a lot of interest in this, and I'm sure it interests much of the audience, but there's a lot more to happen here. So unfortunately, we will have to wind up. We are not able to take any questions from you, but I think Alex is around for a while yet. I'm around, so if any of you want to buttonhole us and pick up thoughts, welcome to do that. But thank you very much. Alex, thank you. It's been a delight speaking to you, and thank you very much, audience.